Let's talk about land use and zoning. The pattern is important because most of today's suburban cities, as well as most of the large scale master plan communities, use the same theory. Arterial or main roads place commercial use and multifamily of the highest density and then transition internally to lower density and higher valued housing. This transition separates land uses, but it is constantly attacked for being inclusionary. In other words, placing the wealthiest people in the best locations and those people in the worst. The inclusionary zoning was developed so that land uses protected property values because appraisals are based on the surrounding and abutting real estate values. First thing wrong about transitional land use is that it places the highest density and most affordable housing along the most visible parts of the city or master plan community. The first impression is the lasting impression, whether one enters a city or a master plan development. The same thing is true about the quality of commercial construction. The hodgepodge of architecture of cheaply built retail, office, and industrial destroys the overall values of both the city or master plan community. However, that first commercial center can define the success of residential that follows. As an example, Woodbury, Minnesota early on enacted a brilliant control on its commercial architecture when it first experienced growth along Radial Drive, its first entry off of I-94 many decades ago. The message it conveyed was, "This will be an elegant and special place to live," which is what happened. Transitional zoning, as evil as it may be to some, does preserve somewhat property values. So what can be done to make it more socially responsible and economically sound? Let's talk about showcasing. Higher density housing is typically higher in the form of multi-story buildings, which are even more visually impacting. Lower income means less architectural budget, clearly a problem for new growth's character. Placing the highest density along noisy traffic corridors, behind retail loading docks, and even railroad tracks places the most human beings in the worst locations. What if we were to flip the transitional zoning on end? Reverse the transition to place the most humans in the best locations and the least people in the worst locations. In theory, that would elevate the value of the highest density, but devalue the most expensive housing, which is true if the design methods of suburban growth never evolves. But this series is about changing everything by thinking differently so that past issues can be overcome with new solutions. What if the lowest price housing and the most families were placed along lakes, ponds, wetlands, and parks? As far as upper end housing, we can design in elegance, even on the most featureless land, which brings us to the next problem with land use and design. When the value of housing gets lower and lower, often the effort to create a well-designed neighborhood also gets lower and lower. The design effort to create better places for these families to dwell should be greater, but that's rarely the case. From planning to architecture to the civil engineering of the site, a greater effort in design can create wonderful places for the greatest number of people who dwell without costing extra. Example, in Tres Lagos, at the entrance, we placed a wonderful upscale retail center, lakes, parks, and the most expensive waterfront housing. Again, it's the first impression that sets the stage for future values. In Maple Lake Village, we use rear-loaded single-family homes along somewhat unsightly industrial and modern farmhouse-style affordable rental units with parking hidden underneath, overlooking parks and ponds to create a viable first impression to a mostly single-family neighborhood. Internally, lower-income townhomes and adjacent senior housing creates a life cycle community without the negative visual impact of residential with less architectural budget. The arterial streets showcase a community without unsightly home rears or screening walls needed. These methods are applied when consulting with cities for better growth practice, as well as when we design large-scale communities. Thinking differently creates a win-win situation for all involved in the growth of our cities.